And it seems like the dominant view of tech entrepreneurship is that there's only one game in town. There's a lot of money, build a big business, go to the moon, die trying.
You want to bootstrap or you want to take VC money. It's true. You raise large round, you're famous. Think about how you're going to land your customer, who that customer is, and then build your product in a way that is sort of oriented to it. And clearly, you can see that the person who has thought like this has put GTM at the heart of their product thing. There are a lot of risks in building a startup. I think a lot of startups are features and not products.
How you almost set up the company itself dramatically changes based on the kind of outcome you want.
There is something as being too early to a market. I think the first 6 months, you should just talk to people.
One of the big advantages of entrepreneurs in India when it comes to actually selling globally is
So, Joydeep, we've in our prior conversations I talked in various ways about different definitions of what winning can look like, right? And it seems like the dominant view of tech entrepreneurship is that there's only one game in town. Here's a lot of money, build a big business, go to the moon, die trying. But you also mentioned in your article that there are different ways to build value. So I guess my first question is, what would you characterize as the different games that tech founders can play? And what game are you playing right now, contrasted to the startup you founded previously?
So I think if you look at, I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question. Let me start with the entrepreneur's journey. So a lot of people, they come out of like a company and want to start something, right? And they start with what options you have available there. I think the biggest one that I see is, as a lot of us know, is you want to bootstrap or you want to take VC money. And there is a fascination in every economy. I think it's not just the Indian economy, it's also the American economy, with raising large amounts of capital and creating large companies and sort of be famous, right? It's true. You raise large round, you're famous. You get your 15 minutes of fame, TechCrunch runs some article, which you bought, by the way, and so on. But, it's not the only choice you have. When I talk to entrepreneurs, I feel that I don't think they know what they're getting when they raise venture capital, exactly what that means for the next 5 to 10 years of their life and what they might go through and so on. Second thing is, I think, let's say they do decide to, like, regardless of which the direction you want to go down on, I think as Rohit sort of alluded in the previous discussion we had, one of your primary challenges is distribution and GTM, right? And again, it is very obvious to people who've kind of done this before, but I don't think early first-time entrepreneurs in particular think about this enough. And they don't think it is core to what they're trying to do. I think they think that it is something secondary, that, I'll figure it out. Let me build a great product, which is great. You need a great product. And then, the GTM will happen, right? Whereas actually, the other way to think is that GTM itself shapes your product, right? That you actually think about how you're going to land your customer and who that customer is, and then build your product in a way that is sort of oriented towards them, right? So to that extent, I think the people who are doing well here, I think, are people who crack that puzzle, right? So it would be a free app, right? That addresses something interesting, important, and sort of like gets traction. The so-called sort of the micro SaaS kind of a phenomenon. I think a lot of people are doing that pretty well, and they're sort of under the a lot of them are under the words. A lot of them are not listening. Just to give an example, I was reading, and there are a lot of these people in the US also. I don't know whether this was a US person or India person. I read about this person who's like, what I do is I just go and do some research on what are popular problems or search queries in specific application areas. So for example, the Jira or Zendesk or whatever, right? And then I go build an app that specifically solves that problem and put it on the marketplace of those platforms. And he does this as a rinse repeat manner, and he's making like a few million a month, just by doing that. So these strategies, I think, and clearly you can see that the person who has thought like this has put GTM at the heart of their product thinking. They actually didn't start with the product, they started with the GTM. What is the problem people face, and can I provide an app in the marketplace that solves that problem? And I'll do this repeat rinse for 20 different platforms, and let's see what happens. And it came out to be fantastic, right? So that I think fun. So I think the other thing that I see very much missing, and I think you guys, particularly over you, would appreciate this coming from the infrastructure background. Somehow I think this country did not exactly get the open source train. I think kind of missed out a little bit on the open source train. And so I talk to a lot of people who are doing infrastructure, which lends itself fantastically to open source. And they're not aware of it. They are thinking directly of jumping to the SaaS, that, I'll build whatever I'm building, I will build the SaaS version of it, sell it and all this stuff. And that's fine. Eventually you have to do that. But for many domains, open source is a fantastic way of solving two key problems. One is the discovery problem, which is that, hey, I don't know what to build. Okay, fine. Let me put something out there. If somebody will write and they will come and tell me either this thing rocks or that it sucks, and this is actually what I wanted you to build, right? And so it's amazing from a discovery perspective. And even from a traction perspective, you should actually end up building something useful. A lot of the companies that you could never get in touch with, even inside them, would be using you. Now, that's not a commercial enterprise, but it's a great way of validating your space, figuring out where the value exists, and getting inside many of the companies that you otherwise would spend millions and millions of dollars trying to get inside. So I think, we are underplaying, in my opinion, because I'm just basing this based on like numerous companies and people I talk to. I think there is very, very little realization of the power of the open source play, why it is important, why it continues to be pertinent even in a freemium model world, right? So another thing that a lot of people don't realize is that freemium is great, but let's say you're in a market where freemium already exists, right? So let's say you wanted to build the next task management system, right? And you want to beat Asana. Well, Asana is already free, right? So you cannot beat Asana at freemium. It's not going to happen, right? But guess what? There's a lot of companies who don't want to use SaaS, or who have the religion that I'm going to run my own stack. Let's not argue about whether it's rational and so on. The thing is that a certain percentage of the market has stabilized into that concept. Now, if you are looking for a niche, an entry point, and you can't out Asana, well, maybe you can do something different that they're never going to do, right? And that can give you a different kind of a toehold. It doesn't mean that, you'll build something as big as them, or that's the best way of solving it, or that's the biggest possible play. But you are looking for an entry point, and this can give you an entry point, right? Now we can keep going. I think the other things, that I think that again, Rohit here would appreciate this a lot, is people also don't realize that I think we have a lot of young entrepreneurs that you need to coexist in the world. So you need like partners, you need friends, and you need foes. Everybody cannot be a foe. That's actually one of the mistakes I did, and I think I feel like we did in the previous company. Your partners can be people who buy you out, right? So just like there's a GTM strategy, well, nobody wants to talk about it, but there should be some thinking around what a possible exit looks like, right? It doesn't mean that you want an exit. It doesn't mean that you can make an exit happen, but at least you can think that, look, these are some ways I can fit into the world in the long term, right? A few things that I think there are a lot of risks in building a startup. I think a lot of startups are features and not products. And that is very apparent to people who've kind of been in the space and who kind of have that lens. But it is not apparent to a lot of young folks. I think also one of the things that people sort of need to realize, that I think, unfortunately, we are still young as a country in terms of technology curves, is that technology, goes through these S-phase. So from starting a company to growing it to sort of peaking to sort of like, maturing of technology, there is a very standard S curve. It lasts anywhere from 5 to 10 years, not longer than 10 years, because by 10 years, everything has become commoditized. And you got to figure out like your game within this 5 to 10 years, right? And so that sometimes means, you take exits early, right? If you're not one of the leaders in a certain segment and sort of you feel like the technology curve is moving to the right and your technology is becoming commoditized and it's getting built into as features into other platforms, it's something for you to think about is, hey, maybe that's a good time to exit, right? And so I think, I don't know, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of these sort of like things that you learn from experience that are kind of not part of the folklore yet, because they are like long-term things. So, how many people have seen a 10-year sort of a startup curve in this part of the world? Very few people, I think. And so the things that are sort of implied by that are not sort of haven't become clear. So there are some things that quickly come up to the top of my mind when you ask that question.
We've had successes like Freshworks and Zoho, but what I don't see a lot of people actually talk about is, I actually feel like one of the big advantages of entrepreneurs in India when it comes to actually selling globally is focusing on enterprise upfront. And the reason almost is because they're able to customize and configure the application a lot more, just because you just need a lot of body to actually end up doing that. So when I look at companies like, let's say, a Whatfix or an Axel Data or an Innovator and so on and so forth, extremely large engineering teams, and they sell to enterprise upfront. For someone who's never sold to enterprise before, it feels scary, right? Or Amagi, that another $100+ million business. Do you feel like that's a trend that's worth following at some sense? Like instead of going SMB and then eventually going enterprise, versus start enterprise first, get those large ticket sizes, and maybe work your way down if you even want to.
Both are valid. Obviously, both are valid stories and valid plays. I think my perspective is that founders should figure out what they want to do. These are different models. They mean different ways of building the product and different GTM motion, as you pointed out. If you're landing $1 million customers, you will not get like one every day. You might be lucky to get one every quarter, or so it's a very different GTM motion, different team DNA. Like obviously you need to have like sales DNA in your team to sell a very high value product. Services DNA is still easy. I think services DNA comes naturally to us. I don't think that's a difficult one, but I think the sales DNA, a lot of us don't have it. My suggestion would be that founders should think about whether this is something that they are comfortable with, they enjoy doing. Probably means also transplanting yourself, almost certainly, or at least traveling a lot, if not transplanting. It certainly means, I think, having some presence, permanent presence in the Valley, in the US in general, and so on, because you can't pull this play off without, every one of the companies that you mentioned, and I know the founders of most of them, their founding teams are either partly or fully in the States. So there is a bunch of things that come with that. And I think I think you cannot have a mixed, I think, as I mentioned in the previous discussion, companies need to be aligned. You cannot do mixture of strategies. You cannot sit out of here and build a company like that. Right? If you want to sit out of here and build a company, you don't build that. You build something else. You probably build something like a Zoho or a Freshworks. But if you're comfortable and able to make that move and go and sit there, then yes, do make that happen. But realize that I think at that point you should also, you'll need to raise much more capital. You'll need to get in people who have a good sales DNA, or spend a lot of time doing sales yourself.
So bringing it back to games you can play, right? If you're a first-time founder, all of these things that you said, maybe I'm listening to this video and I can intellectualize a lot of them, but I don't quite know on day one, or for that matter, even day 90, whether I want to go raise a bunch of money, whether I want to try motion X, motion Y. There's a certain degree of introspection in terms of what you're comfortable with and what your team is good at. But what would you sort of recommend as like the first 1-6-month strategy? Would it be just try and sample everything?
I think for every team out there that is trying to build and so on, I think the first 6 months you should just talk to people. You should just talk to customers, the hell out of customers. You talk to anybody who is potentially a prospect, user, customer of your whatever thoughts you have, and you should have like maybe a few different ideas and talk to different people, and just try to discover what direction you want to go down. Now, I think that feels like too obvious a thing to say, but yeah, people get that wrong too. They start working with one or two sort of people that they can identify as like, everybody has like a network, right? And you can, whatever idea you have, probably your ideas are seeded by your network, right? So you probably have a few people around and you've seen their problems, and if you build something, they'll use it. And that's how a lot of companies start. The challenge is that there is a very strong risk of not really laying a good product foundation if that is the basis of your starting. I think nobody is going to build a product that on day one will get like hundreds of customers. I think that cannot be a reasonable goal. But I think you need to have some picture in your head that I will be able to get there one day. Right? You will not get there on the first day, but maybe I will get there on, after 2 years. Right? Now, in order to go from where you are, from absolute zero to, let's say, having 100 customers, you cannot just look at like 2 customers that you can sign up today and start servicing. That I see people doing that, and I actually some people even create a revenue stream out of it. They have good revenue stream. I've run into people, who have decent revenue stream, but they're stuck with these 2-3 large accounts, right? And they don't know what to do beyond that. Because the problem is they never ask themselves the question that, hey, how do I get from not just these 2-3, but to like, let's say 200 or 500 customers, right? And to do that, you need to talk to a lot of people, and you need to also be super duper aware of competition, right? While it is true that, there is a lot to be said about small teams and executing crazily, and startups have a lot of advantage and all this stuff. But maybe there are other startups already doing what you are doing. Maybe they are well funded too. Maybe they are great teams. So yeah, I mean, sure, all of us think that, we can sort of be the best in the world, and we should think that way, and we should have the best team and so on. But we need to be a little bit realistic that if somebody else has raised a large amount of money and they have significantly more market traction, they're doing the exact same things. Plus, they're probably sitting somewhere in the West. What is my game exactly? And you could share a game. Like you say, look, fine, I'll do this for the, South Asia market or something like that, or APAC market. And there are companies in India we know of that have done that. Right? But I think, I think it is very useful to spend the first 6 months just thinking about this, talking to lots and lots of people, deeply understanding your competition, and just trying to come up with a thesis.
Yeah. I saw, for example, so I used to work at Twitter. I saw Parag Agarwal. I don't know, this is a good example, but the CEO of that company building agents for web. Imagining a world where websites would be agents and then agents talk to agents. And I wonder which customer, assuming that business succeeds, which customer you would talk to get insight that this is actually a need, right? Now, everything eventually has to be grounded in customer value, but seems like some of that would come down to trying to be a bit visionary and thinking about where are models going, what are these curves looking like, what abilities would be unlocked. And I also see this a lot in early stage founders where you're saying, hey, when this happens, I did a bit of this, and I don't know if this is a mistake, but hey, LLMs are a thing. What's going to become very important is context for the enterprise. Now, there's still enterprise use cases, but now working at companies in this space, I see a lot of them sort of looking to the technology for answers rather than looking to customers for answers. And then the conversation is partly around GTM, but also a lot around what is even possible.
I think the success rates for things so far out there is a little suspect, honestly. I mean, again, you have to calibrate it based on the person who is doing it also. There is something as being too early to a market. It happens a lot again, if you look back at my previous journey, partly that was the issue. I mean, not exactly, but there is a very weird dynamic in the whole startup space where your trajectory sort of to some extent gets baked in when you start, right? So how much are you able to grow in the first year revenue, second year revenue? People are very, very focused on these kind of things, right? And so what happens is that if you're too early to a market, you might have the vision correct. Let's say Parag is right and his vision is bang on, right? But let's say he's flatlined for he doesn't have any revenues for 2-3 years, and there's no sign of anything happening, right? Because the world is simply not making a transition to something like that. I know he has a bag of money, so maybe he doesn't care, right? But for an average entrepreneur, you have to care, because at that point you become untouchable. Nobody will, for an entrepreneur who actually wants to raise money, nobody will touch you. It's like, hey, 3 years, these guys haven't gone anywhere. And even if your vision is coming true, why don't I fund the next company that is starting with the vision, that is fresher off the slate, has burned less capital, is more accurate because the vision has sort of come closer, so you can see it more clearly, right? Things that are far are harder to see. Things that are closer are easier to see. This happens in spades, by the way. Spades, lots of early stage companies, people who are too early to the market, they die. And people doing the same thing later on, they succeed in the same market. To some extent, because you cannot ignore the capital side of this. Capital tends to prefer things that are high velocity. And so if you're coming off very low velocity, you may have very good reasons for doing that. But you've burnt a whole bunch of capital. You burnt yourself out because, your capital, your emotional and energy capital is also limited. And you worked on something that, has no, was too early, burnt yourself out. Capital will go to the fresh player. It's a very brutal reality of the market. So I particularly, I think, if you don't have a bag of money, I wouldn't advise the strategy. I mean, if you have a bag of money, then, you can do whatever you want. I guess this is a different thing, right? I mean, your vision is your hobby, right? You can do whatever you want. You can, like, people have started ventures, when we left Facebook, like a bunch of people with a lot of money, they started a venture to deflect asteroids, right? I mean, because they could do it, right? I mean, there is a very famous venture, and I think there is an asteroid headed towards us. So I think they might finally, sort of have business or whatever. So, but let's talk real, right? An average entrepreneur has to realize that there is a 10-year cycle. You can't be too early. You cannot be too late. You have to be a little bit early. Otherwise, you don't have any asymmetric advantage. Everybody knows the information you have. You can't be too early because you will die. You can't be too late because whatever you're working on is a commodity. So very difficult uh, to make that judgment call. Too late, you can understand because there are people in the market. Too early is a little hard because it depends on the pace of life. You have to take some bets. But it's something to think about very deeply. You don't want to be early for the sake of being early. If you are early because you think that my understanding of the market's velocity is deeper. I understand something that nobody else understands. And the market is going to actually converge to this very, very rapidly. If that is the case, then yeah, go ahead, take a bet.
Yeah. So bringing it back full circle to just double click on bag of money more generally, right? So you talked at the beginning about bootstrapping and scaling money and so on, and we briefly touched on M&A as well. Would you, how early do you think about M&A? Do you think this is something you want to think about on day one, saying, here are my exit opportunities? Because that's the game at the end of the day, right? How do you make money from this? I know you mentioned maintain those networks and be in touch with
Yeah,
potential
I
clients.
don't think you think about exits on day one. I don't think it's useful. I think it's actually very, very discouraging, right? Why did you even start a company if you're gonna just sell it, right? I mean, nobody wants to start a company with the goal of selling it. I think what I found it useful is that since the world is sort of like a complex sort of a puzzle, right, and with lots of pieces fitting in, I think that's the better way to think about it. How do I fit into this world, right? So if you come in and say, I'm going to take up the whole whiteboard. Yes, somebody can do that. Maybe OpenAI can do that. Maybe Google can do that. And that's, I think, the platform companies we talked about in the previous stage. But an average startup cannot do that. An average startup needs to figure out, who sits below me, who sits above me, who sits around me, right? And how do I fit into this world? I think that thinking is useful. How is that related to exit? So what happens is, if you think about it, most of the good exits in the world, they happen from pieces of the puzzle that are around you. Somebody wants to expand their portfolio. You are serving the same market as they are, but they don't have your product, right? So they will, potentially look at buying you, right? It could be a backwards integration play or a forwards integration play. Somebody might buy a capability that is above them. A lot of infrastructure companies buy sort of, people who sit above them. They're adding value, vertical that they don't have, right? So I think I personally, like, this is just my naive take, is to think about how you fit into the puzzle, and be close to the companies who are your friends, and go about building your company, but at least you set yourself up for good discussions, awareness in the market that you exist, and so on and so forth. But having said that, look, I'm also not the most experienced writer around here. I think investors actually understand some of this much better than, and because they are in touch with sort of a lot of this sort of ecosystem, and I think that's where experienced investors add a lot of value. So entrepreneurs don't have to worry about this as much. I think they should worry about it from a fitment point of view. But in terms of exits, and I think if you have a good investor, I think they can really help you with some. At least that was my experience. They can help you navigate some of these waters.
Got it. I guess one of the things that a lot of founders, they don't really think about when they start out is what even is a good exit for them. One thing I really push them on is
Right.
okay, there's a basic advice out there regarding hey, make sure you get along with your co-founder. It's like a marriage, blah, 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 all of those things. But there's two things that are really important. One is do your values align, right? And the second thing is what is successful outcome for each of you? Do they sort of align as well, or can they align? Because um, you could have very dramatically, how you almost set up the company itself dramatically changes based on the kind of outcome you want, right? Uh, could you talk about that a little bit more in terms of how you should approach things like fundraising and so on based on that?
Yeah, I think the biggest choice that comes up for people is again, I think this is very well known in startup circles, but I think it is always worth thinking before every round of whether you want to like do that round or you want to see if you can get an exit. It's a very important question, because like for example, okay, so I think let's backtrack a little bit. I think the most important thing that people don't realize is that valuations are a function of growth, and your growth levels off the larger you grow. And it is very, very difficult to maintain sort of, some amazing multiple like 100 or even 50, right? Which you can get at a lower sort of a size when you are much bigger, because your growth will inevitably taper off. And that's why, there are some famous anecdotes in the market, like, 10 to million, $100 million is often like um, you don't gain anything sometimes, by scaling a company. I mean, you imagine that, a company going from $10 to million is like it's a very, very big deal. But, if you were growing like 100% at $10 million and you were growing at 20% at $20 million, God knows, you might be worth the same. And you've just burned like sort of like, like 5 years of your life in between. Again, like there are no right, wrong answers. I think, uh, uh, you know, uh, you should think, I mean, there's a certain amount of fun in the journey itself, and no journey is guaranteed. So, there's also like some amount of risk taking, and, they're just part of the journey. So you cannot really like optimize the hell out of this. I mean, this is not a mathematical equation, right? But it is certainly worth thinking, whether the upside of that next round, after accounting for the dilution, after accounting for the fact that inevitably your growth might slow, right? Unless you know that the growth will not slow or it will continue to be very, very good, right? I think that's a careful sort of a decision. But it is not something that you can plan for, because like one of my older investors, you always used to say, companies are bought, not sold. So you cannot really plan your exits. What you can do is you can be cognizant about your capital burn. So I think there are two variables. We are only focusing on the raising part, but the other part is how you spend money. So your options get narrowed not because you raise money. Your options get narrowed because you burn too much money. And as long as you're careful with sort of burning capital and sort of using it in a way which is productive, right? Meaning that, you are getting substantial new revenue out of the burn that you're getting. You're not getting revenue which is sort of not interesting, right? You're getting sort of interesting revenue, which is a complement to other people and how you might fit into the world. As opposed to, for example, getting services revenue, right? Which is why services kind of can suck, because it's not really sustainable. So I think that is something that has very complex to analyze, but something that's worth deeper thinking. I think founding teams should just sit down and just have that chat. That, look, I'm going to raise like $30 million. How am I going to spend it? Right? Am I in a market where after spending it, I'm going to be big enough to justify it, and also still keep growing enough that my valuation will be substantially more than where I am today. And obviously, to make some like sort of random sort of like guesses and throw some darts on the wall and so on. But I think again, it's kind of like that. The sort of the analog of the planning exercise we discussed at the beginning phases of the company just applied to a more sort of a later stage of the company.
Cool, Joydeep. This was really fantastic. I end up learning a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it was a pleasure talking. I hope it is useful. Yeah, it is. Some of this, and I think I'm not the only one. I think that there's like sort of a lot of entrepreneurs, some entrepreneurs in this space in our region who have gone through long journeys and experienced. And I'm really glad that you are, your team is sort of putting these episodes together to surface some of that up, because it is somewhat rarefied knowledge, and it is not easy to get access. And yeah, all the best. Hope you continue to have many more episodes like this.
Yeah, absolutely.